After his grandfather's funeral, David Cole's cousins mocked him for inheriting nothing but a $7 mountain cabin. But when he and his loyal dog, Shadow, reached the cabin, the silence felt different, like it was hiding a secret. Shadow began barking at a worn rug, and beneath it they discovered a hidden steel hatch. It led to a sealed Cold War shelter. What was hidden beneath it, that would change everything. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. The afternoon sky above Hamilton, Montana, was the color of steel and silence. Thin gusts of mountain wind brushed over the rows of headstones, carrying the faint scent of pine and frozen soil. The small-town cemetery sat at the edge of the valley, where snow lingered even in early spring. Standing a little apart from the mourners was David Cole, a man in his mid-40s with short, dark hair streaked by gray and a neatly kept stubble shadowing his strong jawline. His posture, straight but weary, spoke of years spent following orders, surviving deserts and ruins in foreign wars. His uniform days were long behind him, yet the soldier's restraint still lived in his eyes. Beside him sat Shadow, a large black-and-white German shepherd with a thick coat, broad chest, and calm, intelligent gaze, the kind of dog that moved only when necessary, like a quiet sentinel. David's hands were tucked inside his coat pockets, fingers pressing into the folded funeral program. He barely noticed the small talk, the sound of boots on gravel, the whispers of cousins who hadn't seen him in years. He was focused on the simple headstone that now bore the name Henry Cole, his grandfather, the only man who had never judged him for coming back from war different. Henry had been a practical man, an engineer who built things that lasted. David had hoped to feel something final standing there, but instead he felt suspended, like grief had missed him by inches and left only a hollow ache. When the ceremony ended, people moved toward their cars. A tall man in a navy coat lingered near the road, adjusting his spectacles as he gathered a few papers. That was Mr. Lewis Grant, the family's longtime lawyer, a soft-spoken man in his late 50s with thinning silver hair and a reputation for doing things by the book. He walked toward David with a small, sympathetic smile. "Your grandfather left a will that should be read today," he said, his voice low but precise. "He asked that you, Richard, and Calvin all be present." Inside the funeral home's small office, the three men sat opposite Mr. Grant's oak desk. Richard Cole, the eldest cousin, was in his early 50s, square-jawed, heavy-set, the kind of man who measured success by the shine of his wristwatch. He ran a construction business in Billings and rarely missed a chance to remind everyone of it. Calvin, younger and softer around the edges, had the thin patience of someone used to following Richard's lead. David kept silent, letting the two brothers fill the room with nervous chatter. Mr. Grant cleared his throat and unfolded the single-page will. "Henry Cole," he began, "leaves his savings, certificates, and family heirlooms to his grandchildren in equal shares." He paused, then continued. "Additionally, he leaves to his grandson David Cole a small property located on Bitterroot Ridge, along with a check for $7. Richard barked a laugh, slapping his knee. $7 and a shack? Guess the war hero gets the charity prize." Calvin smirked but looked uncertain, as though half ashamed. David didn't answer. He only studied the envelope Mr. Grant slid toward him. Inside was the check and a folded note written in Henry's familiar uneven handwriting. "Don't let anyone else tell you what this place is worth." He stared at those words for a long moment. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers. The bitterness he expected didn't come. Instead, a quiet curiosity began to form, like an echo of something unfinished between him and the old man. As the cousins left, Richard muttered over his shoulder, "Hope you bring a hammer, soldier. That place probably collapsed years ago." David ignored him, slipping the note back into the envelope. He looked down at Shadow, who waited patiently by the door, eyes bright and unblinking. The dog tilted his head as if asking for a command. David knelt, brushing his hand through the thick fur along Shadow's neck. "Looks like we're going to Bitterroot Ridge," he murmured. The dog's ears perked up, and for the first time that day, David felt a reason to move forward. Outside, the cold wind had softened. The last light of evening fell across the mountains, turning the snowfields into bands of silver. The funeral cars were gone. Only David and Shadow remained in the quiet, two figures outlined against the valley. One man, one dog, and a promise left hanging in the wind. By dawn the next day, the sky over Hamilton glowed pale gold, and the chill of the mountain air clung to the windshield of David's truck. He drove west along a narrow forest road, its surface lined with fallen pine needles that whispered under the tires. The world felt both wide and lonely. Just him, the faint hum of the engine, and the rhythmic sound of Shadow's steady breathing in the passenger seat. The dog, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and white coat, sat upright, eyes trained on the passing trees as if guarding their path. Occasionally, his ears twitched at the cry of an eagle or the crack of ice on the river below. David found quiet comfort in that presence. Shadow was steady, loyal, and never asked for explanations. Halfway up the ridge, the road narrowed into gravel. The truck jolted with every rut, the old suspension creaking like the memory of an aging song. On one sharp bend, a figure appeared in the mist, a woman in a brown ranger jacket, hand raised in a polite signal to stop. David braked. She stepped closer, revealing Ranger Emily Ward, a tall woman in her mid-30s with sun-browned skin, high cheekbones, and auburn hair tied into a low braid. Her green eyes were sharp but kind, the sort that measured people before speaking. "Morning," she greeted, voice firm. "You heading up Bitterroot? Not many do this time of year. Snowmelt can make the ridge road unstable." David nodded, explaining briefly about the property. Emily studied him a moment, recognizing the disciplined stillness in his stance. "You've got that soldier calm," she said softly. "Watch for landslides past mile marker 8, and keep your dog close. There have been wolves roaming near the ridge." David thanked her, and as he pulled away, he caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, standing still against the mist, one hand resting on her belt radio. She was the kind of person the wilderness respected, steady, unshaken, part of the mountain itself. He wondered if his grandfather had known her or someone like her, a protector of the same woods that now held his secret. An hour later, the forest opened into a high clearing. The mountains loomed above like sentinels of gray stone, and there, at the edge of the slope, stood the cabin, small, weathered, but whole. Its wooden walls were darkened by years of sun and rain, a thin fringe of moss tracing the edges like time's handwriting. The tin roof was scratched dull silver, a few shingles bent from past storms. Yet the structure still breathed with quiet strength, as if built to withstand solitude. David parked near an old pine stump and stepped out. The air smelled of sap and cold earth. Shadow jumped down beside him, tail low but alert. They walked to the porch. The steps creaked faintly under David's boots. The door gave a dry groan when he pushed it open. Inside, sunlight filtered through dusty window panes, catching motes that danced in slow spirals. The cabin was simple: a square wooden table, a folding chair, an oil lamp, and a rusty radio sitting on a shelf. Against the far wall lay a faded rug, worn thin where footsteps had once passed. David walked the perimeter, touching the walls with a kind of reverence. He could almost feel the weight of his grandfather's solitude here. Decades of silence folded into the grain of the wood. He imagined Henry sitting at the table, listening to static crackle from the radio, perhaps waiting for messages that never came. The thought tightened something in David's chest. Shadow circled the room, nose pressed to the floorboards, tail twitching in concentration. Then suddenly, the dog stopped. His body stiffened, and he barked sharply toward the rug, pawing once at its edge, but not touching it again. David frowned. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. The shepherd barked again, gaze fixed and insistent. Kneeling, David lifted the corner of the rug and froze. Beneath it lay a circular metal plate, scratched but intact, stamped with the words, "Civil Defense Shelter, 1959. The sound of wind pressed against the cabin's walls, low and steady, like breath. David stared at the metal hatch, the words echoing in his head. Whatever secret his grandfather had kept, whatever truth $7 had bought, it waited beneath that door, sealed in silence and dust. The metal hatch creaked open with a sound like a sigh from another time. Cold air breathed up from the dark, dry chamber below. David knelt beside the opening, his flashlight beam cutting through decades of stillness. A narrow steel ladder disappeared into shadow. He hesitated for a moment, his breath clouding in the chill, then glanced at Shadow, who sat alert by his side, tail low, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Stay close," David murmured. The German shepherd tilted his head once in understanding before following him down, paws clicking softly against the metal rungs. At the bottom, the beam of light revealed a small underground shelter no larger than a storage shed. The walls were lined with smooth concrete, cracked slightly along the edges, and shelves held relics of another age, sealed tins of water, faded military manuals, a dented helmet, and a rusting field radio. Dust coated everything like thin frost. In the center stood a wooden table with a cracked oil lamp, and beside it a small leather-bound journal whose cover had darkened with age. David brushed away the dust, revealing initials burned into the leather. H.C., his grandfather's steady hand. He sat on an overturned crate, opened the book, and the smell of old ink and paper rose around him. The first page bore a short, uneven line written in a hand that trembled slightly. "Silence is not guilt. Sometimes it is duty." David read it twice, the words echoing in the hollow space. They felt like a confession and a command all at once. The following pages described a storm in the winter of 1962 when the Bitterroot Valley was buried in snow for weeks. Henry Cole, then a civil defense engineer, had been assigned to maintain a series of government shelters stocked with supplies. When the blizzard hit and the roads closed, the town's mayor refused to open the emergency stores, fearing federal penalties for misuse. But Henry, against orders, had broken the locks and distributed food and blankets to families trapped by the snow. David turned the page. The handwriting grew more frantic. Henry wrote of how he was accused of stealing government property, dragged before a tribunal, and stripped of his post. The town he'd saved turned its back on him to avoid scandal. "I thought silence would protect them," Henry wrote, but it only buried the truth deeper. David's throat tightened. He could almost see the old man, standing in some drafty hall, shoulders squared, taking blame for others. It explained everything. The bitterness that had crept into Henry's voice in his final years, the way he avoided speaking of his past. Shadow moved closer, his nose twitching. He pressed a paw against the concrete wall near the table, where the plaster seemed newer than the rest. David shone his light there and noticed faint tool marks. He retrieved a small metal pry bar from a shelf, wedged it into the seam, and pried loose a thin section of wall. Inside was a steel box. Small but heavy, its hinges rusted shut. On its lid, a faint engraving read, "To be seen when the world listens again." He placed the box on the table and wiped the dust away. Inside lay a stack of letters tied with twine, a few black and white photographs showing snow-buried houses and smiling townspeople, and an identification badge bearing Henry's name and the seal of the Department of Civil Defense. Underneath them was a single tightly sealed film canister, marked with faded ink. The Bitterroot Storm, 1962. David's pulse quickened. This was proof, evidence that could clear Henry's name. He sat there for a long time, the light flickering off the metal walls, the silence broken only by Shadow's quiet breathing. When he finally closed the box, his expression had changed. The grief that had followed him since the funeral began to shift into something steadier. Resolve. He whispered to the dark as if his grandfather could still hear him. "I'll finish what you started." Above them, wind swept across the ridge, whistling faintly through the cabin seams. The sound was neither mournful nor cold. It was the mountain exhaling, carrying the weight of a secret finally found. By the next morning, the sky above Bitterroot Ridge had turned a pale, winter gray. The wind rattled the tin roof of the cabin as David packed the steel box into the back seat of his truck. Shadow jumped in after him, tail brushing the seat, eyes bright and alert, as though he knew they were carrying something that mattered. The drive down the mountain was long and narrow, the air growing warmer as the pines thinned into open valley. David's mind replayed the words burned onto the box lid. To be seen when the world listens again. It felt less like a message and more like a challenge. In town, Hamilton looked smaller than he remembered, its main street lined with brick buildings faded by time. He stopped in front of Clara's photo studio, a place he hadn't seen since childhood. The shop front bore an old wooden sign painted in flaking gold letters. Inside, the air smelled faintly of developing chemicals and coffee. Behind the counter stood Clara Wright, a woman in her early 70s, short and lean, her silver hair pinned neatly in a bun. Her face, though lined, still held the sharp, intelligent expression of someone who had seen too much history to take it at face value. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate, traits left from decades of handling fragile film. When David introduced himself, her eyes widened. "Henry's grandson," she said softly. "You have his eyes, tired but stubborn." She gestured for him to sit, and he placed the metal canister on the counter. "It was in his shelter," David said. "I think it's from the Bitterroot Storm in '62. The name alone seemed to pull something heavy from her memory. She pressed her lips together before replying. "That winter nearly buried this town, and it buried a good man's name, too." Clara worked in silence, preparing the old projector. The room darkened as the film began to roll, its flickering light filling the walls with moving ghosts. Snow swirled across the screen. There were families huddled in a church basement, soldiers carrying crates, a man in a heavy parka breaking open a supply vault. Clara gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "That's him. Henry," she whispered. The footage showed Henry distributing rations, guiding people through the storm while the mayor's car sat stranded nearby. The camera caught his face, calm, focused, selfless. Then the reel ended abruptly, leaving the sound of the projector spinning into silence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Clara's voice trembled when she finally said, "He saved those people. The town council blamed him to protect themselves. I was the secretary then. I typed the reports. I knew the truth, but they told me to stay quiet." She rubbed her eyes, ashamed. "Your grandfather carried their guilt alone." David looked down at the canister, feeling a knot in his chest that wasn't grief anymore. It was purpose. "I'm not letting it stay buried," he said quietly. Clara met his gaze. "Then you'll need more than a film. There were letters, witness statements. Some of the old archives might still exist in the courthouse basement if no one burned them." Shadow, who had been lying at David's feet, suddenly stirred and looked toward the window, ears twitching. Outside, a pickup truck idled across the street. Two men sat inside. One of them was Richard, David's eldest cousin, his thick arms crossed, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. His expression was a mix of suspicion and anger. Clara noticed the truck too. "Friend of yours?" she asked. David exhaled slowly. "Family," he said, "the kind that shows up when they smell something valuable." He took the reel of film, thanked Clara, and turned toward the door. "If you find anything in those archives, let me know," she said, her voice firm now, as if something long dormant had stirred within her too. David nodded, sliding his hat low against the wind. Shadow followed, muscles tense, ready for whatever came next. The truck engine across the street revved once before driving off. David watched it disappear into the distance, the canister of film held tightly in his hand. The truth was no longer just a memory. It was evidence, and evidence had a way of drawing out the wrong kind of attention. The storm clouds rolled in over Bitterroot Ridge by late afternoon, turning the mountains a dark shade of iron. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and pine resin, and the wind whistled through the tin roof of the cabin like a restless ghost. David sat by the wooden table, studying the stack of letters he had recovered from the hidden box. Shadow lay near the door, his head resting on his paws, one ear twitching each time the wind struck the windows. The dog's eyes, amber and sharp, had that quiet intelligence of an animal who sensed things long before they happened. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the stillness. David looked up. Through the window he saw a black pickup truck crawling up the narrow path. Another vehicle followed, a silver SUV. The sound was wrong for this remote place, too confident, too careless. Shadow rose instantly, his body tense, tail rigid. David stood, jaw tightening as he reached for his coat. He already knew who it was. The first man out of the truck was Richard Cole, his older cousin. Richard was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with thick forearms and a square face darkened by stubble. His eyes, gray and cold, carried the smugness of someone used to getting what he wanted. Years in the construction business had given him power and money, but they'd also carved a permanent sneer into his expression, a look that said, "I win, you lose." Behind him followed Tom Reynolds, a burly man in a green flannel jacket, a local handyman known for his short temper and quicker fists. Two other men came after, strangers, both wearing work boots and the bored expression of people hired for muscle, not conversation. Richard's voice cut through the wind. "Didn't think we'd have to come all the way up here, Dave," he said, stepping onto the porch like it already belonged to him. "But rumors spreading you found something valuable. Film? Documents? Whatever it is, it's still family property." David stayed by the doorway, posture straight, calm but unyielding. "This place was left to me," he said evenly. "You weren't mentioned in that will." Richard smirked. "A $7 will? Come on, you think a cabin and some junk make you special?" Shadow growled, a deep guttural warning that vibrated through the porch. The hired men hesitated, exchanging looks. Tom spat on the ground and muttered, "Dog's got attitude." Richard waved him off, his arrogance swelling. "Relax, it's just bluffing." He stepped closer, boots scraping the wet boards. The German shepherd took 2 steps forward, teeth bared, the fur along his neck bristling. The bark that followed was sharp, explosive, echoing through the trees. David didn't move, but his voice dropped lower, colder. "Don't test him, Richard. He's better at reading men than I am." The rain started to fall in light sheets, drumming against the roof. Richard froze for a moment, realizing just how close the dog's snarl was. To his leg. One wrong move, and Shadow would lunge. He raised both hands slightly, pretending to laugh it off. "Fine," he said, forcing a grin. "We'll do this the legal way. Enjoy your little hero act, soldier." As he turned to leave, Tom kicked at the ground, muttering a curse. The group climbed back into their vehicles, doors slamming, engines roaring to life. The trucks rolled down the slope, taillights vanishing into the curtain of rain. For a long time, the only sound left was water streaming from the roof and the low rumble of distant thunder. David crouched beside Shadow, resting a hand on the dog's neck. The tension in the animal's muscles slowly eased. "Good boy," he murmured. "You held the line." Shadow's tail gave a single thump against the floorboards. David looked out into the mist where the trucks had disappeared. He knew this wasn't over. Richard was too greedy to quit, too proud to admit defeat. Somewhere between those rain-darkened hills, family had turned into opposition. Lightning cracked above the ridge, and the valley echoed back like a warning. Inside the cabin, David locked the door, placed the letters and film back into their box, and whispered to the empty room, "They'll come back, but so will the truth." A thin layer of frost coated the morning streets of Hamilton when David parked outside the Montana Department of Veterans Affairs. The building was modern and sharp-edged, glass, steel, and stone, a contrast to the old town that surrounded it. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed quietly as he walked down the corridor, the box of evidence held firmly in his hands. Shadow, left waiting in the truck, watched him through the windshield, ears pricked, breath fogging the glass. The German shepherd had grown restless over the past days, as if sensing that whatever had begun on the mountain was reaching its end. At the reception desk stood Officer Raymond Holt, a tall man in his late 40s with broad shoulders, clean-cut hair, and a precise, almost military demeanor. His uniform was immaculate, and the small silver star on his chest reflected the light when he moved. Holt had the calm authority of someone used to listening before speaking, a habit born from years of handling veterans' appeals and forgotten cases. "Mr. Cole," he said, extending a hand. "We received your call about new evidence regarding Henry Cole. You said you have film documentation?" David nodded, setting the steel box on the counter. "And letters, original witness accounts, all from 1962. Holt gestured toward his office. "Let's take a look." The room smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. On the wall hung framed photos of Montana soldiers through the decades. As David explained everything, the cabin, the journal, the hidden shelter, the film, Holt's expression shifted from polite neutrality to quiet disbelief. When the film played on an old projector, the room fell completely silent. The flickering light showed Henry Cole leading families through snow, handing out supplies, guiding children into safety, while the town's mayor stood idle in the background. Holt leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his jaw tightening. "That's not theft," he said under his breath. "That's command under crisis." When the film ended, Holt stood and took a long breath. "Mr. Cole, this is enough to reopen the case. I can't promise politics won't interfere, but I'll see it through personally." His words carried the steady conviction of a man who had seen too many forgotten heroes go unacknowledged. He took the evidence, shook David's hand firmly, and added, "Your grandfather deserved better. Let's give it to him." Weeks passed, snow melted, rivers rose, and Hamilton's small newspaper offices began buzzing with headlines. One morning, a folded copy of the Montana Ledger landed on David's porch. Across the front page, bold letters read, "Henry Cole cleared of all wrongdoing. Heroism recognized after 6 decades." Below the headline was a photo of Henry as a young man, smiling faintly in his engineer's uniform, next to the official statement, "For his actions during the Bitterroot Blizzard of 1962, Engineer Henry Cole is posthumously awarded the Montana Humanitarian Medal. His initiative saved 47 lives." The ceremony was held at the town's Veterans Memorial Hall. The place was small but warm, filled with flags, old uniforms, and quiet pride. Clara arrived first, wearing a dark green coat and holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her silver hair gleamed beneath the soft light. When she saw David, she smiled gently. "He'd be proud, you know," she said. "Not for the medal, he never cared for those, but for you, for not letting his story die." The event began. Officer Holt stepped onto the podium, his voice firm as he read the commendation. David stood beside the table where Henry's photograph rested in a simple wooden frame. The medal lay before it, shining beneath the light. In the back row, Richard entered quietly. He looked older somehow, the arrogance worn off his face, replaced by something almost fragile. Regret. When the speech ended, he approached the table, placed a hand on the frame, and whispered, "You were right, old man." Then he turned to David and said, "You didn't do it for yourself. You did it for him." David met his eyes and nodded. No anger remained, no victory, just peace. He knelt beside Shadow, scratching the dog's ear as the ceremony drew to a close. "We did it, buddy," he murmured. The German shepherd wagged his tail once, pressing his head into David's hand. Outside, the frost was gone, replaced by sunlight spilling over the valley. For the first time since the funeral, David felt something lift from his shoulders. The truth, long buried, had finally come home. The snow had melted from the slopes of Bitterroot Ridge, leaving the earth soft and dark beneath the budding pines. Morning light spilled gently through the trees, turning the mist into ribbons of gold. The cabin stood quietly in that clearing, its wooden walls darkened by time, edges touched with moss and sunlight. The winter storms had passed, and the place that once carried the weight of silence now breathed with peace. David stood in front of it, a hammer in one hand, a small bronze plaque in the other. His face, lean and weathered, caught the pale warmth of the sun. A few gray strands of hair glinted near his temples, and his eyes, once shadowed by loss, now carried a calm certainty. He knelt beside the door and fixed the plaque into place, each strike of the hammer echoing softly through the valley. When it was done, the words shone clearly in the light. Henry Cole Memorial Shelter. For those who kept their word. David stepped back, brushing sawdust from his palms, and let the words sink in. They were simple, but they carried everything his grandfather had stood for: loyalty, integrity, and the quiet strength to do what was right, even when no one believed in you. Shadow lay on the porch nearby, his thick coat gleaming under the sunlight. The German shepherd's muzzle was dusted with gray now, a sign of the years that had passed beside his master. His body was large and strong, yet his movements were gentle, loyal to every gesture David made. When the wind carried the scent of spring grass, Shadow lifted his head, ears perked, eyes soft. David smiled faintly. "You remember him too, don't you, boy?" The dog gave a low rumble in his chest, a sound halfway between a sigh and a growl of contentment, then rested his head on David's boots. David walked to the small table inside the cabin where an old leather journal lay, the same one his grandfather had written half a century ago. Its pages, worn and yellowed, seemed to hum with quiet life. He opened it slowly to the last entry and read in the familiar handwriting. Honor does not live in medals or records. It lives in the moment a man chooses to believe in what is right. For a long moment he said nothing. His hand trembled slightly as he traced the ink with his fingertips. Then, closing the book, he whispered, "I believe, Grandpa. I always did." Outside, the air filled with birdsong. The wind that once howled with snow now carried warmth and life. In the distance, the sound of the river echoed faintly, melting ice turning to flowing water. David sat on the porch beside Shadow, shoulders relaxed, eyes on the rising sun. The plaque on the wall caught the morning light, gleaming bright as if Henry himself stood there smiling in its reflection. The war, the silence, the shame, all of it had settled into peace. And on that quiet ridge above Hamilton, Montana, the truth no longer needed to be spoken. It simply lived, carved into the wood, carried by the wind, and guarded by a loyal dog that had never once left his master's side. Sometimes God hides miracles in the smallest acts of faith, like a man restoring his grandfather's honor or a dog guarding a memory until the truth finds its light. This story reminds us that even when life feels silent and unfair, God is still working in the quiet, turning pain into purpose and shame into redemption. Maybe today your miracle is already unfolding, not in thunder or fire, but in stillness, patience, and love. If you believe in second chances, in divine timing, and in the unseen grace that binds families together, share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every story we tell keeps that light alive. May God bless and guide everyone watching, today and always.